Hey, book lovers. Welcome to While I Read. I'm Katie Dodrell, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my all time favorite authors, D.E. Stevenson. It's getting into the fall and winter, it's colder outside, and this is the time of year that I want to read books that I find cozy and comforting. And no one fits that description for me better than D.E. Stevenson. So, D.E. Stevenson is a British author who was most popular probably in the 1950s and 60s, although she wrote from the 1920s through the 1970s. Her books were marketed as light romantic fiction, and I think they were very popular during that mid century time period. Her books are set mostly in England and Scotland. A lot of them take place in London, or at least part of them takes place in London, and there are also a lot of them that take place in the Scottish border areas or even in the Highlands. Some of her books are part of series, others are standalone books. But even in the standalone books, one of the cool things is that a lot of times characters from one book will pop up in another book, like they'll make cameo appearances. Like it'll be a minor character who, is maybe like a doctor in a book, and he'll turn up as the doctor in another book too. And for fans of D.E. Stevenson, it's always fun to find these little cameo appearances. An interesting fact about D.E. Stevenson is that she is related to Robert Louis Stevenson. He was her cousin, although, of course, she never knew him, but he was known to be her cousin, so that's an interesting fact. D.E. Stevenson was her maiden name, Dorothy Emily Stevenson. She was married and was actually Dorothy Emily Peploe. And there's also a fairly famous Scottish painter with the last name of Peploe that she was related to. So, lots of interesting facts about D.E. Stevenson. For a long time, D.E. Stevenson was out of print. All of my books are used either from library book sales or bought from online used bookstores. But recently, like within the past few years, some of her books have been reprinted. They're even available as ebooks now, and I have some of her books on Kindle, so I'm excited about that. And I love my collection of D.E. Stevenson books. I just think these old library books just have so much character, and I love that they take up a whole shelf on my bookshelves. And actually, I have a few of her books that are not on this shelf because there was not room for them. So, my history with D.E. Stevenson started when I was in high school in the 90s. My granny was the branch manager of the public library in my small town. And so I would go to the library a lot. When I was little, I would go there and stay with her sometimes. And when I was older and could drive, I would drive to the library and I would talk to Granny. I would just hang out at the library. I would walk around in the bookshelves, and I found the D.E. Stevenson books there. And so I decided to check one out. And I just found those books just so calming and comforting. They were describing this way of life that was completely different from what I was experiencing growing up in a small town in Georgia in the 90s. The books that I read by her, some of them were set in England during World War II or just before or just after World War II. A lot of them were set in small Scottish villages. And I just loved reading these books and just finding out about life in the time period that she was writing. And Granny would always let me know when the library was planning on having a book sale and, putting some of the D.E. Stevenson books for sale. And I would always go and buy all of the D.E. Stevenson books that I had. So I don't think the public library in my hometown has any more D.E. Stevenson books now. I have all of the books that used to belong to the library back in the 90s. Some of them were there from like the 70s through the 90s, at least from looking at the checkout dates inside the books. At one point in like the early 2000s, I joined an online group for D.E. Stevenson. It was an old Yahoo email group. I think the group still exists. It was called the Desies, like Dessie, Desies for D.E. Stevenson. And I loved reading what the members of that group would put. They would just have discussions about the books, and the people were all so nice. And I actually found that the website that one of the group members created that I remember looking at back, in the early 2000s when I joined the group, that website still exists. And I used it to do some of the research for this episode. And I'll link that website in the description. And I'm really wanting to look and see if that group still exists and start talking with them about D.E. Stevenson again. So, as I said, D.E. Stevenson books are just the ultimate comfort books for me. I like to read these books when I'm feeling stressed or if I feel sick, because, for one thing, they remind me of when I read them when I was a teenager and that comfort of sitting in the library with my granny reading those books. And also, they're just really calm, peaceful books. So, what I want to talk about today are some of my favorite D.E. Stevenson books to read in the fall and winter. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Shoulder the Sky. So, this book is one that I got from the public library. You can see the old checkout card, and I think some of these little receipts here are from when I checked it out from my granny. So, isn't that neat? And you can see that it was withdrawn from the library. So, it is set in a small village in Scotland called Drumberly. And it has an alternate title, Winter and Rough Weather. And if I look at the inside of it, it says Shoulder the Sky, a story of winter in the hills. It's about James and Rhoda, who are a newly married couple, and James is a sheep farmer. He is starting out as a sheep farmer, farming on some land that his uncle owns. And he and Rhoda have just gotten married. Rhoda is an artist. She has been living in London and has kind of had a bohemian lifestyle in London as an artist. She was afraid that she would not be able to devote time to painting if she got married and had children and all of that. But she and James were in love. So they did get married, and this book is the story of them starting off their married life at this sheep farm in this very isolated area of Scotland. They're extremely cut off. They live near James' aunt and uncle, and they love them. They have a great family relationship with them. But there is a river that's between the two houses, and sometimes the river starts flooding or it's frozen and they're not able to cross, and James and Rhoda are just cut off. They don't have a telephone. So Rhoda really struggles with this lifestyle at first. She loves James, but this is totally different from her life in London. And so at first, she's not very happy. But the book shows her learning to appreciate this life, learning that there are really wonderful things about it, and also learning that she can still paint. She can still be an artist. And so that's something that was always really fun to me to read in this book. When I first read it, I remember telling my dad that I wanted to be a sheep farmer when I grew up, because to me that just sounded like this great life. Like James would just go off every morning and walk around the hills with his sheepdog, herding his sheep. I know it's really not that simple, and the book doesn't portray it that simply, but just imagining that kind of lifestyle seemed so cool to me. And of course, James and Rhoda are not the only characters in the books. There are other characters. There's a young doctor who they're friends with, and there's sort of a mystery in his past that James and Rhoda help him with. It's just a very good book. And like I said, it's a good book to read in the fall or winter. It's all about cold weather. You see the picture here, the snow. So I've always loved this book. The next D.E. Stevenson book that I like to read in the fall and winter is Blow the Wind Southerly. This copy is not as pretty as the other copy. It's just green, so I guess there's no point in holding it up because it's not that pretty to look at. But it's a really good book. So, like I said, it's called Blow the Wind Southerly, but it does have two alternate titles. One of the other titles is The Enchanted Owl, and then another alternate title is Charlotte Fairley, which is the name of the main character of the book. A lot of D.E. Stevenson books were published with several different titles, which is just an interesting fact. So in this book, Charlotte is the headmistress of a girls' school. And I can't remember if the school is in England or Scotland. But she's this headmistress. She is a very smart woman, very intelligent, very successful, but she's also very lonely. At the beginning of the book, she talks about how, as the headmistress, it's hard for her to be friends with any of the other teachers at the school, and she's so busy that it's hard for her to get away from the school and meet friends in any other ways. So Charlotte ends up going to visit one of the students from the school at her home, which is on the island of Targ, which I believe is in the Scottish Highlands. And she is staying with her student, and the student's dad is the laird of this island. So it's really cool. He's basically Highlander. So, that's pretty cool. So Charlotte falls in love with him, but she doesn't feel like it would be the right thing to do to marry him. There's lots of drama with that. There's a section of the book where she's alone at Christmas time, and she goes and stays at this inn, and it just describes her peaceful time there. I'm just going to read that section to you. The weather continued mild and pleasant, with cloudy skies and blinks of golden sunshine. Charlotte went for long walks through the woods and fields and came back to the Green Lion ready for the plain, wholesome meals provided by Mrs. Phillipson. She spent some time in the church reading the brass inscriptions. She walked up and down the terrace behind the church, and occasionally, if it were warm enough, she sat upon a wooden seat which had been placed in the shelter of the tower. There was a delightful view from here, a view of green meadows and brown fields and a wooded ridge of hills. So I just loved reading about that. D.E. Stevenson's descriptions of the places she writes about are always great to me. So Blow the Wind Southerly is a great book to read anytime, but it's especially cozy for the fall and winter. Another cool thing about Blow the Wind Southerly that I meant to mention, it takes place in 1954. It was written in 1954, and one of the things that happens in the book is that Charlotte has tickets to go to Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in London, but for various reasons, a nefarious plot by someone, she ends up missing the train and isn't able to watch the coronation in London, but has to watch it on TV. So it was always neat to me to read that part because it seemed like it was such a long time ago, but at the time I was reading it, Queen Elizabeth was still living, and it just felt like it was this neat part of history, but something that was still going on. The next book I want to tell you about is Celias House. And this book is another one that I got from the Butler Public Library from my granny, so it's special to me. This book is set in Scotland, and it's about a family estate called Dunnian. You can see a picture of Dunnian House here. And it starts in 1905 when Celia Dunn, who is the owner of this house that's been passed down for generations. Celia has never married, and so she meets with her nephew, or her great nephew, Humphrey Dunn, to tell him that she is leaving the house to him in her will. But one of the conditions is that he has to leave the house to his daughter, Celia. And Humphrey is like, well, I have kids, but I don't have a daughter named Celia. And his great aunt is like, oh, well, you're going to have one because you have to leave this house to Celia. So Humphrey and Celia passes away within a few years, and Humphrey and his family move into Dunnian and take possession of it. And they do eventually have a daughter named Celia. And so the book is about the family growing up and living at this house. Of course, like I said, it starts in 1905. It goes through World War One, and it ends during World War Two. So it's a really neat book because it covers so much time period and such an interesting time period in British history, world history, and it talks about how this family and this estate are affected by all of these world events. It has lots of characters in it. There's not just one main character. Celia, the young Celia, is an important character, but there's also another character named Deb, who is Celia's cousin. And one neat thing about this book is that it's sort of a retelling of Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I say sort of because it has other elements to it, but part of it, especially the story of Deb, Celia's cousin, is Mansfield Park. And when I read this as a teenager, I was like, is D.E. Stevenson plagiarizing from Jane Austen? I didn't really understand that authors do that sometimes. They do retellings of classic works. And so that was always something that I was like, that's really strange. But it is neat that it has these elements from Mansfield Park as well. It's just a beautiful story of this family and the things they go through over 40 years of life. So, next I'll talk about Sarah Morris Remembers. So, like Celia's House, this book takes place over a number of years. I believe it starts in the 1920s and it ends, I think, right around the time World War II was ending in the 1940s. It's about a woman named Sarah Morris, and it starts when she's a child growing up in a village in Scotland, in the vicarage. Her father is the vicar, and it's just about her life. Sarah ends up falling in love with a man from Austria, and she falls in love with him right around the time that World War II is starting. And I learned a lot of history from this book. For instance, the Anschluss. I'm sure I learned about that in history class in school, but in this book, it came alive for me much more. So the man that she is in love with, her fiance, ends up going back to Austria to check on his family. I can't remember if this is before or after the Anschluss. And he disappears. He just vanishes without a trace. And Sarah and her family don't know what to think. And so her family urges her to just move on with her life. She and her father end up moving to London because her father thinks that he can be of more service if he's in London. So they are in London during the Blitzkrieg. And it's really interesting reading about that from this perspective of somebody who is living through it, living through these bombings, and how basically they were just continuing to go on with their lives. Every now and then they'd have to go and stay in a shelter for a night. I think at one point the home they're living in is destroyed, but luckily they aren't in it when that happens. And so it's about Sarah and how she continues with her life even though she's heartbroken and terribly worried about this man that she loves. That's something that I always love about D.E. Stevenson books. They're about people who face some pretty hard things and who just continue doing what they need to do. They don't give up, they don't wallow in their defeat. And the books are very inspirational in that way. So this is one of my favorites. Next, I'll talk about Still Glides the Stream. This is a book that I found in a used bookstore online. It has this inscription in it, "To Yolande with love, Jean and Dave," which is just so neat. It's always nice to imagine who was Yolande, who were Jean and Dave. Were they her parents and they gave it as a gift? And how did it eventually end up in a used bookstore. Why didn't she keep the book? So I just always love reading those in used books. This book is set in the 1950s in a small village in Scotland. It's about this man named Will Hasty. I believe he's supposed to be 35 years old, somewhere mid to late 30s. And he has been doing military service, but now he is coming back to his village and he's going to be a farmer for the rest of his life. And so he and his father are living in their home and he's learning the business of farming from his father. But then Will finds out a few things about the death of a friend from a few years ago that I think it was supposed to be an accident, but he starts wondering if maybe it wasn't really an accident. And he has to start investigating some things. This is just a good book because it talks a lot about Will and his activities on the farm. He does end up going to the south of France as he's investigating things. There is a mysterious French woman involved. There's also a literal girl next door who has been Will's friend his whole life. And, you don't know who's he going to end up with, the mysterious, beautiful French woman or the girl next door who he's known forever, and which one will be the right one for him. It has lots of scenes of quiet life in a Scottish village, lots of scenes of Will walking over the farm and just enjoying his life. So it was always a good comfort read for me. The last book that I'll talk to you about is called Anna and Her Daughters. This one, again, is not that pretty of a copy, so there's no reason for me to continue holding it up. But as you might guess from the title, it's about a woman named Anna and her daughters. Actually, it's from the point of view of I believe it's the middle daughter named Jane. And there are three daughters, Helen, Jane, and Rosalie. And as the book starts, their father has just died. The girls are all in their teens, and they and their mother are on their own in London, and they find out there's not much money left. So their mother decides to move the family to Scotland. I believe she owns a small home, or she's inherited a small house in Scotland, something like that. So she and the girls moved there. And so, like I said, the book is from the point of view of Jane, and it's just telling about what happens after they move to this small village. The oldest daughter, Helen, ends up going back to London and getting a job there. And then the middle daughter, Rosalie, she stays there in the small village. I forget exactly what she does. Jane ends up getting a job working as an assistant to an author in that village. And then Jane ends up becoming an author herself. And there's one section of the book where Jane's family is traveling, and so she's on her own for a little while. And I'm just going to read you that section that I love so much. For the first few days, I enjoyed my holiday immensely. I made sandwiches and put them in my pocket and walked miles over the hills. It was a pleasant feeling to be free to do as I wanted, a feeling I had never experienced before. I remember one day particularly. There had been frost in the night, and there was rime on every twig of faded heather like diamonds glittering in the bright morning sun. In every little burn, there were icicles hanging from the rocks. The sky was blue and cloudless, and there was not a breath of wind. It seemed wonderful to me. I walked along slowly, enjoying every moment. And it continues from there with that description, but I just love that description so much. So Jane ends up becoming an author herself. And it's also about some heartbreak when the man that Jane is in love with ends up actually getting married to her sister. And so Jane has this secret heartbreak that she can't tell anyone about. But in that D.E. Stevenson tradition that I love, Jane doesn't wallow in her misery. She just continues with her life. She writes her books. She makes money. At one point, she goes on a cruise around the world. So it's a good book about this woman who, does something that I would like to do one day, becoming a successful author. So there you have it. I love D.E. Stevenson. I've loved her for many years. And at this time of year, when it gets dark early and you just want to be nice and cozy inside reading something comforting, these are the perfect books to read. I hope that you liked this video. I would love to find out if you've read any D.E. Stevenson books, or if you haven't, what are some of your favorite comfort reads? If you liked this video and you want more book recommendations and reviews, please subscribe to my channel. Now, go visit a small village in Scotland while I read.